so economic development organizations and natural resource companies and communities and just project developers. In the context of carbon projects, Rob has been actively involved for First Nations governments and developers, and some of the activities include acting for purchasers and sellers in regarding to the acquisition of carbon credits in the voluntary markets, as well as assisting and develop forest carbon sequestration projects in other countries, including Brazil, Belize, and the Congo. Acting for developers for clean biomass gasification and other technologies to help reduce emissions from industrial activities and energy production, and also negotiating and advising issues relating to fiber and biomass supply agreements for alternative energy projects. He also provides advice relating to amendments into British Columbia legislation to facilitate carbon capture projects, in particular the Western Climate Initiative, and also Rob is our counsel for the Cohen Commission, which is a commission on the missing salmon of 2009. There were approximately 10 million sockeye salmon expected back to the Fraser River, all the way up to our territories in north central BC. And there's a commission on why so many salmon are missing, and Rob is our lead on that side too as well. But Rob Miller has a presentation today, and I'll leave it up to you, Rob.
Okay, thanks, Terry. I think we may be running a little short on time here. So what I would like to do is to first turn off my video camera, which I don't quite know how to do, but Terry will be relieved to know that I actually dressed for this event. And I think rather than preparing my whole speech or going through my whole presentation, because of the time, I will just discuss a couple of the key concepts, because I think some things have been covered in the other event. I wanted to talk initially about the anatomy of a carbon project, because I think that's important for a lot of the participants on this call to understand what's involved in creating and developing a carbon project. I then wanted to talk about sort of applicable legal regimes, or sort of the lack of legal regimes and regulating mechanisms that exist that affect carbon projects, and then look at the legal context relating to carbon projects and First Nations, in particular looking at the intersection of Aboriginal rights and title with carbon law. And you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes around carbon law, because it doesn't really exist right now until our governments at all levels get organized and decide what they're going to do to address climate change. And I think this is a recurring theme coming out of today's presentation. And we've heard Ed, John, and also Brad and Harry talk about the need to upgrade the role of Indigenous people in the UN Forestry Forum, and the need to lobby and negotiate recognition of Aboriginal interests in carbon rights in tenure reforms. And when I talk about the legal context, I'm certainly going to touch on that as well, and that's probably the primary theme coming out of today's presentation. I'd also like to talk about why forest carbon is a good fit for First Nations and what First Nations bring to the table. I had wanted to talk about key legal agreements, so development agreements, which are agreements between project developers and actual people that own the carbon. And I would say that in many instances, particularly in British Columbia, but also throughout Canada, First Nations are or have a strong claim to ownership of the carbon, and we'll talk about that. And also emissions reduction purchase agreements, or ERPAs, which are agreements pursuant to which carbon rights are bought and sold. However, just given the timing constraints, I don't think I'll talk about the key legal agreements. So what I would say is, in the event that you're ever involved in a carbon project and you're asked to enter into one of those types of agreements, you will have my presentation, which I understand is being posted on the website for this event, and it just lists a bunch of issues to consider, in the event that you're negotiating one. In terms of the simple anatomy of a carbon project, one of the things that I wanted to do is just give a baseline understanding of how a carbon project comes together, and this is a very simplified model, but I recognize that much of the audience will have a different background and understanding of the carbon world, but I wanted to make sure that we all start out just from the same sort of understanding. So when people start thinking about developing a carbon project, the first thing to do is identify the project. What is going to be done to create offsets? And depending on the context, different things will need to be done, but generally, offsets need to be measurable against some sort of baseline. So there needs to be an improvement over business as usual. They need to be additional. They need to be real, as in somebody can go out in the field and confirm that they exist, and there needs to be some level of permanence. Once a project is identified, there's a market assessment that occurs, and that'll really inform what the project looks like moving forward. So the market assessment involves asking the question, what do markets want? And Brad talked about the voluntary versus the regulated or compliance markets. In Canada right now, we're largely dominated by voluntary markets, which are people buying credits either to offset their own emissions because they think it's the right thing to do, or to offset their own emissions for marketing or public relations reasons. The determination of what market you're selling into and what standard that market wants really informs the next large bubble, which is the standard for the project is chosen. And choosing the standard for a project is an important step because it really informs what's required in order to create marketable offsets. In the voluntary market right now, especially in the forest sector, the VCS, or Voluntary Carbon Standard, is quite popular. But depending on where the credits are going to be sold, there's a myriad of different standards. Regional markets, such as Pacific Carbon Trust in British Columbia, also have their own requirements. Once the standard is chosen, project document is put together, and this project document focuses on what will need to be done and how it will be done in order to develop the project. Once the project document exists, there's an ability to raise money to actually implement the project based on what's said in the project document. And I think Barb Hendrickson and Doug Tingey will talk about this in a future session. The implementation bubble at the bottom of this anatomy is simply making the project happen. It's going out on the ground in the context of a forest carbon project in the forest, ensuring that deforestation is avoided, ensuring that improved forest management practices are carried out, or ensuring that trees are planted in areas where there historically have not been any trees. So it's actually doing the work to create the credits. Once the work's been done, consultants will come in and confirm that the requirements of the standard that has been chosen have been met, and this will lead to the issuance of credits or offsets. Offsets that are issued can be registered in a title registry, and there's a number of them, that some of which are standard specific. So if you have VCS credits, there's VCS credit registries, and these act like brokerage accounts. So once you're the registered owner of credits, you can buy, sell, and trade them simply by changing the name on the account that holds the credit. Ultimately, what happens is that credits are retired, and once they're retired, they can't be used again. So an example of retirement is if the developer of a project, say a cement plant that has 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions in a year, wants to become carbon neutral, either because it's required to by law or because it thinks it will assist in its marketing, it goes out, it buys 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent credits, and it retires them. I'll skip over this applicable regimes slide simply because Brad touched